What if I told you that behind the velvet ropes of Graceland, on a day shrouded in sorrow, some of the most unexpected icons in American history quietly stepped into the shadows, paying their final respects in utter secrecy? Names so surprising, you'd never believe they were there. Whispers of their presence lingered for decades, but the truth was carefully kept from the public eye. Until now. The air at Graceland that day was thick with silence, the kind that clings to you and makes even the softest footsteps sound loud. Fans lined the gates, holding flowers, pressing photographs to their chests, and murmuring prayers as the king was brought home for the last time. The mansion, usually a symbol of glamour and rock and roll royalty, felt frozen in time, draped in an invisible veil of sorrow. Even the Memphis summer sun seemed dimmed, as if nature itself mourned with the world. Inside the estate, where family and a tightly guarded circle of friends gathered, the weight of the moment was almost unbearable. Vernon Presley, usually a man of few words, stood trembling before the crowd. His voice cracked as he spoke, struggling to express the magnitude of the loss. "Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to take this opportunity to thank you for all the cards and letters you have sent since the passing away of my son Elvis," he began. His words, though simple, echoed with raw pain. He talked about how deeply touched the family was by the outpouring of love, the flowers, the messages, the endless tributes. Yet behind the gratitude was a father utterly shattered, trying to hold it together for a public that had adored his son just as fiercely. He admitted without shame that he hardly understood what was happening around him, that the grief had hit so hard he felt as though he was watching the day unfold from somewhere far away. In the middle of the tightly knit gathering, Vernon stood so disoriented that he didn't recognize faces he'd known for years. "I was so dazed with shock and misery," he later recalled. "I didn't even see or recognize some of the people at the funeral." Imagine being surrounded by familiar voices, arms that embraced you, but being too numb to notice. That's the level of heartbreak that filled the Presley home. There were hugs, there were tears, but also a few silent presences in the background. Faces that came and went quietly, some famous, some mysterious, and one or two whose attendance would stun the world if only the public had known. Among the gathering of mourners, a few familiar faces quietly emerged from the shadows of grief. Figures the public might have expected, yet seeing them together in such a moment brought a weight that words can barely capture. Priscilla Presley, elegant but visibly shaken, stood close to her daughter, young Lisa Marie, who clung tightly to her mother's hand. The innocence in Lisa's wide, searching eyes pierced through the haze of sorrow, like a fragile reminder of the life Elvis had left behind. They moved slowly through the sea of mourners, their presence silent but powerful, as if every step carried the memories of a lifetime. It wasn't just about saying goodbye, it was about holding each other up, piece by piece, in a world that had suddenly shifted beneath them. Nearby, another presence stirred the emotions of those watching closely. Anne Margaret, the actress and singer who once shared an unspoken bond with Elvis that extended beyond the silver screen. When she arrived, there were no press flashes or dramatic entrances, just a quiet, aching reunion. She and Vernon hugged each other tightly, their shared heartbreak flooding the space between them. They cried openly, no longer hiding the depth of what they had lost. Her sorrow was unmistakable, yet dignified. But in that tender moment, very few noticed the man who stood just a step behind her. Roger Smith, her husband. He had come in support but remained largely unseen, standing back as if to give space to a connection deeper than words. In the blur of emotion, Vernon later admitted he hadn't even recognized him. Every movement, every whisper of grief in that room felt magnified. Those in attendance were more than just famous names. They were human beings, broken by a loss they couldn't yet fully comprehend. The hush that fell over Graceland wasn't just out of respect. It was the collective breath of those trying to process the unimaginable. And while some attendees stood in the light, others lingered just beyond it. Faces that quietly paid their respects without fanfare, blending into the background. But who exactly were they? And why were their names kept under wraps for so long? That's the part of the story most people never got to hear, until now. As the procession continued and guests arrived one by one, the list of familiar names began to take shape. Colonel Tom Parker, the man who had steered Elvis's career from the very beginning, stood off to the side, dressed somberly, his eyes unreadable. It was hard to say what he was thinking. Grief, guilt, reflection, perhaps all three. Not far from him, the unmistakable figure of James Brown made his way through the crowd with a quiet reverence. He wasn't there as the godfather of soul. He was there as a friend, a fellow legend, and a man saying goodbye to someone who had forever changed music. Actor George Hamilton, known for his charm and tan, looked nearly unrecognizable, his usually suave demeanor dulled by the weight of the occasion. And then there was Ginger Alden, Elvis's fiancée, still reeling from being the one to find him in his final moments. Her face pale, her posture rigid, as if still trying to make sense of a reality too cruel to accept. These names, though iconic, felt like the expected players in a heartbreaking final act. But what if we told you that not everyone in attendance was known to the world that day? What if, quietly and without cameras or headlines, a few individuals stepped into that sacred space, people whose names, when revealed, would leave even the most devoted Elvis fans speechless? The truth is, behind the curtain of celebrity and sorrow, a handful of secret guests came and went without notice. And most people still have no idea they were ever there. Just when it seemed the roster of mourners couldn't carry any more star power, whispers began to circulate, quiet nods, barely audible exchanges among those who knew to keep their voices low. One of those whispers carried the name Sammy Davis Jr., who had arrived not as the dazzling showman the world adored, but as a grieving friend. He didn't come to be seen, and few even noticed him slip in. But those who did said he looked somber, heartbroken, even smaller somehow beneath the weight of the loss. He didn't make a speech. He didn't linger. He came to pay his respects, to mourn a man who had once stood beside him in the golden age of entertainment. And then, just as silently, he was gone. Then came an even more astonishing revelation. John Wayne. Yes, the Duke himself. Though his presence wasn't broadcasted and no photographs marked his attendance, a few trusted sources confirmed that he attended a private ceremony separate from the main gathering. He wasn't there for publicity or spectacle. He came quietly, perhaps out of a deeply personal respect, perhaps because he understood what it meant to be an American icon, loved yet burdened by fame. Those who caught a glimpse of him said he looked different, older, slower, and deeply reflective. His attendance wasn't part of any official list, but it happened. And to this day, many fans are still shocked to learn it. Even more unexpectedly, two names stood out not for their loud presence, but for how surprising they were in that setting: Chet Atkins and Bill Murray. Chet, the guitar virtuoso who had quietly influenced Elvis's early sound, arrived with a soft reverence, staying close to the background. He didn't need to be front and center. His music had already spoken volumes about their connection. And Bill Murray? Yes, the very same who would later be known for his comedic genius. He was young then, far from the household name he'd become, and his appearance at the funeral remains one of the most puzzling yet oddly touching footnotes in this story. Whether they're out of friendship, admiration, or something more private, Bill kept to the margins, his presence barely noticed by most. That's the thing about this ceremony. It wasn't just private, it was sacred. And for those lucky or heartbroken enough to be there, it would be a moment sealed in memory, never fully explained. As the final moments of the ceremony unfolded, a quiet procession formed around the casket. Elvis's closest companions, the men who had stood by him through triumph, turmoil, and everything in between. The pallbearers weren't just acquaintances chosen for tradition. They were the people who had shared the most intimate corners of his life. George Klein, one of Elvis's oldest friends from high school, walked with a heavy heart, his steps measured by memory. Jerry Schilling, another lifelong confidant, stayed close, his expression unreadable, his grief etched deep behind his eyes. Joe Esposito, who had practically been a brother to Elvis, and Dr. Nick, the physician who had seen him through his most vulnerable moments, rounded out the circle. Alongside them were family members like Billy and Gene Smith, names not always in the spotlight, but forever part of the inner circle that held Elvis's trust. Their hands gripped the casket, but what they carried was far heavier than wood and metal. It was decades of friendship, loyalty, and the unbearable weight of finality. As the casket was laid to rest, all eyes turned to Vernon Presley. The man who had raised the boy that became the king now stood at the edge of a goodbye no father should ever have to make. He looked down, tears quietly falling, and whispered with trembling lips, "Daddy will be with you soon." It wasn't meant for the cameras. It wasn't said for anyone to hear, but someone did. And that moment, raw and unfiltered, captured everything that words could never truly express. It was more than grief. It was the cry of a father's broken heart, echoing into the stillness. That day at Graceland, something more than a legend was laid to rest. And yet, just when it seemed like the final chapter had been written, there remained one lingering question, one haunting mystery that no one was ready to answer just yet. In the days that followed the funeral, as the world mourned and the crowds eventually dispersed, Vernon Presley remained behind the gates of Graceland, carrying a silence that echoed louder than any tribute. When asked to speak about his son's life, he didn't offer long speeches or carefully rehearsed answers. Instead, he gave something far more intimate. His life was always in God's hands, he said softly, his eyes tired but sincere. It was a statement laced with acceptance and spiritual surrender, a father's way of finding meaning in a loss that defied understanding. In that simple truth, Vernon found comfort, believing that Elvis's journey had always been guided by something greater, even when the path seemed chaotic and cruel. But grief doesn't soften with fame, nor does time always heal a heart so deeply broken. Vernon never truly recovered from the loss of his only son. In the quiet spaces of Graceland, long after the fans had gone home and the news cameras turned away, Vernon's sorrow lingered like a shadow. Friends say he grew quieter, slower, more withdrawn. His health began to decline, and his spirit, it seemed, was already somewhere else. Just 2 years after burying Elvis, Vernon himself passed away on June 26, 1979. Those who knew him said it wasn't just old age or illness that took him, it was heartbreak. Yet there was peace in his passing, as if he had waited long enough, loved hard enough, and could finally rest. And maybe, just maybe, that rest meant more than an end. Maybe it meant a reunion. There's something hauntingly beautiful in the thought that Vernon, Elvis, and Gladys, father, son, and mother, are now together again. No longer separated by time, fame, or tragedy, but united in a place beyond the pain of this world. For those who believe in something more, the Presley family is whole once again, praising God and holding each other close in the eternity they never quite found on earth. But before we close this chapter, there's still one final piece of the story left to uncover. One truth that's been buried deeper than any headline ever dared to go. Elvis Presley's funeral wasn't just a farewell. It was a moment frozen in time, filled with a depth of emotion that even words can't fully capture. From the heavy silence that blanketed Graceland to the tears of those closest to him, every detail carried its own haunting beauty. Familiar faces mourned in the open, while others chose to grieve in the shadows. And then there were those whose presence, only recently uncovered, adds a new layer of intrigue to a story many thought they already knew. The air was thick with reverence, loss, and something else. Something unspoken, a lingering sense that not everything was as it seemed. Because in that sea of sorrow, behind every whispered goodbye and hidden tear, was a deeper mystery waiting to be understood. So now let me ask you, if you had one final chance to say goodbye to Elvis, what would you have said? What words would you choose knowing they'd be your last? And among all the guests, which name caught you off guard the most? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear what moments touched you or took you by surprise. And if you felt something in today's story, if a memory stirred or a truth struck a chord, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell. There's more untold Elvis history just around the corner, and trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next.